Hi, I'm Tom Biebighauser, owner of Wetland Restoration and Training. I've built over 3,000 wetlands and streams over the past 46 years. I've written 4 books about wetlands and how people can build them to help our environment. I'm happy to be here today with you. We're going to be talking about wetlands in this video, their many values to society, and in future videos, we're going to be looking at how you can design and build your own wetland. I am convinced that wetlands are amongst the most important ecosystems in the world. Visit a wetland and you're going to see wildlife. You're going to see a beautiful landscape, an intriguing landscape. You're going to see a lot of wildlife species using wetland areas. And wetlands are uncommon features on our landscape. Stay with us in this video and you're going to see what these different wetlands look like. So first of all, what is a wetland? A wetland's a soggy place. If you walk in a wetland area, you're going to get your feet in the mud. But wetlands are amazing because of the plants that grow in them. In a wetland, you find plants that are growing in saturated soil and they can survive standing water. They don't drown like other plants. And the wetland plants are really unique with their adaptations. The wetland that you're looking at has water lilies growing in the deeper water in the center, and it has cattails and bulrushes growing around the edge. And if you look on a little bit drier ground around that wetland, you're going to see shrubs like alder and willow growing. And on even higher ground near the wetland, you're going to find trees like bald cypress and maybe swamp white oak. Wetlands are beautiful to look at. This is why we see them on calendars. This is why they use photos of wetlands as screensavers. And this is why when you're driving down that highway and everybody's head turns, more than likely they're looking at a wetland because there's animals in that wetland. And who doesn't like watching wildlife? Wetlands are the greatest places to see wildlife. Wetlands can be any size. The small wetland that you're looking at, you think, well, does that have any value? Yes, it does. If you're a marbled salamander, more than likely, you're living in that wetland, laying your eggs in that wetland. If you're a fairy shrimp, this is where you live, in these shallow wetlands. The marbled salamanders are eating the fairy shrimp. So yes, small wetlands are of value. But now large wetlands, are they something to behold? This wetland you're looking at is over 1,200 acres in size. It's huge. And this wetland is so important to migrating ducks and geese and swans. In the spring, you could see thousands of ducks and geese migrating and using this wetland. And in the fall, you're likely to see just as many. These are important migratory stopovers. Now, if you enjoy watching wildlife, wetlands are the best place to visit. You're likely to see mallards and wood ducks, red-winged blackbirds, yellow-headed blackbirds, and even turtles and frogs and toads and salamanders in wetland areas. Why are wetlands so important to wildlife? Because there's a lot for animals to eat in a wetland, and also there are many places for them to hide from predators. If you like to go fishing, and who doesn't? Wetlands are important to fish. First of all, wetlands clean dirty water. Fish need clean water to live in. So if there are wetlands on the landscape, they act like giant coffee filters to clean that water coming into the wetland area. And wetlands are important for fish reproduction. If fish lay their eggs in deeper water of a lake or a river, those eggs are going to get eaten by other fish. If fish lay their eggs in a shallow water wetland with plenty of aquatic plants like cattails and bulrushes, then their fry, their little fish, can hide. And then they find plenty to eat, all the plankton and phytoplankton and all the protozoans, and then later all the invertebrates. So yes, wetlands are important nursery areas for fish. Well, there are many different types of wetlands, and there's all sorts of legal definitions of wetlands, but we're going to go over some of the types of wetlands that you're likely to see in your travels. First of all, you are looking at an emergent wetland. An emergent wetland contains saturated soil, just like all the other wetland types, but it has plants that are growing in shallow water. These plants emerge out of the shallow water. And some of the plants that we find in emergent wetlands are bulrushes, we find cattails, and we find sedges in shallow water emergent wetlands. Beaver will build dams to make emergent wetlands. Now, when you look at popularity of wetland types, I think the emergent wetland is going to win the prize in any contest because it is the type of wetland that is so full of life. And the emergent wetland is likely to contain water all year. Let's take a look at another wetland type. We call this the wet meadow wetland. What's a wet meadow? It's like a prairie, only it's watered all year by that water saturated in the ground. Wet meadow wetlands will contain sedges, rushes, and grasses that are adapted to living in the saturated ground. And in a wet meadow wetland, you're going to find a lot of wildflowers. If you're interested in pollinators like butterflies and bees and moths, then the wet meadow is the place to go. Because in the wet meadow, you'll find this diversity of flowers, and all the pollinators are using these flowers, and the flowers are there all summer long because of the moisture in the ground. And wet meadows are also important to small mammals like mice and voles. You go, I don't know really if I like small mammals. Well, if you're a hawk or an owl or a fox or a coyote, what do you feed on? The small mammals that are found in the wet meadow wetland type. The forested wetland is the next wetland type that we're looking at. The forested wetland has trees in it. Some people call it a swamp. And if you visit a forested wetland, you'll notice that the topography is what we call pit and mound. There are many pits where big trees fell over and many mounds that are the root masses of the trees that fell over. And oftentimes in a swamp or a forested wetland, we find huge trees like the bald cypress, the swamp white oak, the Shumard oak, or we may find other species in the west like the western red cedar. And swamps are probably one of the least common wetland types. Most of the trees have been cut and they've been converted to farmland. But they're an exciting place to visit. They're not dangerous, they're not dismal. They're really just wonderful lands to enjoy and to explore. Now, this wetland is called a shrub-scrub wetland. We need a name change, don't we? We should call that a shrub wetland. Why? Saturated soil, and it's growing all these shrubs like willow and alder and dogwood and buttonbush. And these shrubs, many of them flower, which are important for pollinators. But looking at wildlife species that use shrub wetlands, if you're a deer trying to hide from a predator, you duck into a shrub wetland. If you're a bird nesting, you can hide your nest and your young in a shrub wetland. In a shrub wetland, you're likely to find this little bird called the American woodcock. This is a bird that will feed on earthworms in a shrub wetland because the alder shrubs, when they drop their leaves, they're high in nitrogen, and you have all these earthworms that are in the shrub wetland type. But as far as attractiveness goes, I think in many ways shrub wetlands are the least attractive of all the wetland types and probably the most undervalued. They have great importance for flood control, great importance for cleaning runoff from parking lots, but they're the type of wetland that people tend to ignore. So it's kind of easy to fall into the trap that wetlands have limited, if any, value to humans. And how we get into this, I think all we have to do is to listen to politicians, and they'll say it's time to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C. Or we listen to developers that complain about wetland regulations because they can't fill in that worthless swamp to build their homes or their businesses. Well, I would like to talk about the values of wetlands and how they're really underrated by society. Did you know that over half of the endangered and threatened species of wildlife and plants live and depend on wetland areas for their survival? Let's go out west. In fact, let's go to Arizona and New Mexico, into the desert. There's this frog called the Chiricahua leopard frog. It has to have wetlands for its survival, for laying its egg, for living. Now, let's go to California. We have the California red-legged frog, which is a threatened species. It depends on wetlands that do not have fish in them so it can reproduce and so it can survive. And let's take a look at the whole North America. Bald eagles, endangered species, depend on wetlands for their survival. They feed on the ducks, they feed on the fish that are living in the wetland areas. Now, if you are a rancher or a farmer, you know the value of wetlands to provide water for your livestock. You have horses, you have goats, you have cattle. They have to have wetlands and the water in them to drink. And they also feed on the aquatic plants in wetland areas. Now, in the Southwest, there is a great concern about the lack of water and how everything is becoming dry. Well, what wetlands will do is that they will capture the snowmelt and they'll capture those infrequent rains and they will inject that water into the ground. And this replenishes water, groundwater, and we use that groundwater for drinking and we use it for irrigation. So more and more communities are now restoring wetland areas to clean runoff from parking lots, runoff from ditches, and they're also restoring the wetlands to control flooding. Flooding is becoming a major concern in many communities, and these communities are bringing back the wetlands, gives people a place to see wildlife, cleans water, and also controls the flooding out there. So if wetlands are so great, why do we see them still being filled and still being drained? I think one of the main reasons is mosquitoes. People fear mosquitoes and the diseases they carry, and they just assume that wetlands are where mosquitoes breed. Well, this is not true. When you visit a wetland area and you sample invertebrates in the water, you're going to find water boatmen, water striders, you're going to find dragonfly larvae, damselfly larvae, you're going to find all sorts of aquatic beetles, and if you look carefully, you're likely to find salamander larvae or tadpoles. And then there's frogs and toads and salamanders that are adults. So all these larvae of these vertebrates and invertebrates, they're feeding on mosquitoes. They're feeding on the mosquito eggs and they're feeding on the mosquito larvae. Now, during the day, if you visit a wetland area, then the adult mosquitoes are being eaten by tree swallows, and they're being eaten by dragonflies and damselflies that are flying around. Go out to a wetland area at night, and the mosquitoes are being controlled by bats that are feeding on the adult mosquitoes. So where are the mosquitoes breeding if they're not breeding in a healthy wetland? Well, they're breeding in these puddles that we find caused by road ruts. They're breeding in bird baths that are not, the water isn't changed in them, or maybe watering troughs for livestock. The mosquitoes are breeding in 5-gallon buckets that are left outside, or maybe in gutters that don't drain. None of these are healthy wetlands that have the mosquito predators. So what do we say about a healthy wetland? Mosquitoes may check in, but they won't check out. So wetlands, they are so important to us, and they're so beautiful to look at. So this has been Wetland Restoration and Training. I'm Tom Biebighauser. I invite you to visit the website for Wetland Restoration and Training, to subscribe, and to stay tuned for future videos where we'll be talking about how you can design and build a wetland to help the environment. Thank you.